Welcome, everyone. Dr. Ahlam Muhtaseb and Andy Trimlett. You might want to take yourself off mute, Andy. Um, First of all, I want to thank you for being here today. That was a very, very powerful and at the same time difficult film to watch. I'd like to thank all of the attendees. This particular film is the first of our virtual film screenings for the Milwaukee Muslim Film Festival. Our normal film festival that was supposed to take place in September of 2020 had to be canceled, just like so many other things. So hopefully this year, 2020, we will have a full film festival, but this is part of a virtual series that we decided we were going to run once a month. And we started with your film. We felt that that was just a powerful film, very timely with a lot of the things that are going on. We want to thank all of the people that signed up. We were thrilled with the attendance today. We had quite a number of people, so we're excited. Again, let me just begin by introducing the two directors of this film. Dr. Ahlam Muhtaseb earned her BA in English Language and Literature from Hebron University with the help of a Fulbright grant from the U.S. government. She earned her MA in Government Relations and her PhD in Mass Communication Media Studies from the University of Memphis, Tennessee. Since 2003, she has been a professor of communication studies at California State University, San Bernardino. Muhtaseb has conducted extensive field work in the Palestinian refugee camps in Lebanon, Syria, and Palestine. Her most recent research is focused on digital media and the Arab Spring, with a special emphasis on cyber activism and online social movements. Welcome, Dr. Ahlam.
Thank you so much.
Andy Trimlett received his MA in Middle East Studies from the University of Washington and his BA in International Security and Conflict Resolution from San Diego State University. He has worked as a producer for KPBS for over a decade, working on everything from A Salute to Vienna to Panda Tales and even a zombie-themed fundraising video. Now I need to see that. He received a regional Emmy for a KPBS documentary he co-produced about Proposition 13. Welcome, Andy Trimlett.
Thank you very much.
We are really thrilled to have both of you here live, and we're going to begin, and we invite our guests to enter their questions into the chat, and we have our guests would be happy to answer them. Our first question is from an inventive viewer named Jay Hansen. Do you think there is still a chance for a two-state solution? And you can both take turns answering the question. Dr. Ahlam, you want to start?
Sure. First, thank you very much, Janan, for the introduction and for inviting us. And I would like to thank the Milwaukee Muslim Women's Coalition and the Milwaukee Muslim Film Festival for this great opportunity of having this conversation and the film screening. And I also would like to start by acknowledging that I live and I work on the indigenous lands of the First Nation of the Serrano and Pichanga tribes. Now, to go back to the question, although it's not related to the film, but I will try to answer. I personally don't think there is any room left for a two-state solution, unfortunately. I mean, even if we try, facts on the ground indicate something else. I mean, with the colonies, the Israeli colonies scattered all over the West Bank, around Gaza, now with the annexation of the Golan Heights and the semi-annexation of the West Bank, I mean, Israel really has chalked over the years any chance of a two-state solution. And I believe that in a way, I mean, we could have a positive attitude about that and say, well, it's okay because that only leads us to one state solution for everyone with equal rights, one man, one vote, basically. So that's how I see it. I don't see any chance for a two-state solution. Andy, would you like to add or comment?
Yeah, basically the same thing. I would add just some details. You know, when people hear about Israeli settlements in the West Bank, for example, a lot of times the picture that it comes to the American mind is, you know, the shack on top of a hill with a flag and one person. And in reality, when you go there, these are full cities with, you know, universities and shopping malls and swimming pools. And this is not like something that you can just pick up and move. And so if there's going to be a two-state solution, where do you put it? Where's the map that you can draw that will allow for a Palestinian state? I just don't see how you do it.
Yes, absolutely. I agree with both of you, and I think that that's actually something that many people, even within the Jewish community, have realized, that the idea of a two-state solution is no longer viable. What the options really are, either a one-state democratic country like the United States, or an apartheid state. That's basically, I think, what the options are. Let me ask you a question. Can you tell us a little bit about what motivated you to make this film?
Go ahead, Andy. I'll give you the chance not to start. Then I will.
Sounds good. So I got into this. I got my master's in Middle East studies, and during school and even in my bachelor's, I studied the Israeli-Palestinian conflict a lot, a great deal. And I could spout back to you, you know, the dates and the places and the people you're supposed to know to get the A on the test and all that. But at the end, after I graduated, quite frankly, I didn't really get it. Like, I couldn't explain to you why it continued year after year, decade after decade. Like, I couldn't wrap my head around that part of it. And it wasn't until after I graduated and I started looking at the year 1948 that everything started to make sense. Not just that history, but also what's going on today with the home demolitions and the building of the wall, and, you know, every element of what's going on today made sense once I looked at the history of 1948. And I realized that if I could get a master's degree in Middle East studies and still not quite get it, how is the average American who's watching, you know, Fox News and CNN and MSNBC, how are they ever going to be able to wrap their heads around this conflict? And so I said, somebody has to make a documentary about this, and apparently that was us.
Yeah, for me, this started with my scholarly journey. So I'm originally Palestinian, of course, and I lived actually more than half of my life in the city of Al Khalil, or Hebron, in the West Bank in Palestine. And I came to the United States actually on the Fulbright scholarship to stay only for 1 year and study the lobbying process, basically, to study the impact of the lobby on us, you know, information dissemination, our image in the media, etc. And then this journey, of course, took way more than 1 year. And so one of the first things I decided to do in 2003 was to start on a journey of kind of decolonizing knowledge on Palestine. And I wanted to start with studying the narratives, the Shatat narratives, of diaspora narratives of Palestinian refugees, focusing on Lebanon, but also I did field work in Syria and in Palestine. And in 2006, I got several grants as a junior faculty member at that time, and I went to Lebanon, but my research was interrupted. And I did some filming. I took actually one grant to buy filming equipment and got training, etc. And I did some work in Al Yarmouk refugee camp. I actually did a lot of nice filming there before it's destruction. And I did some work in Lebanon, but then my work was interrupted by the Israeli invasion of Lebanon in 2006. And so I had to come back. In 2007, I met Andy. In 2008, I decided to go back. I had, brief chats with Andy over, several other projects that he was working on. Actually, he wanted to do a film in Lebanon, etc. And when he learned about my journey, he convinced me to join forces, and he explained to me what he just explained right now, and said, you know what, if we actually make a documentary on the origins, the roots of the conflict, and how it's still ongoing. It still impacts what we see today. And since it was related to what I was doing, he sold me the idea, and we started working together in 2008, and it took us about 10 years to release the film when we released it at the Arizona International Film Festival.
Yeah, when I first started working on this, I said, this is the biggest project I've ever been involved in. It's we're not gonna be finished until like late next year. I was off by a factor of 10, but hey, yeah, we finished.
To release it, it took us about a little bit over 9 years. But then there was a lot of work in the distribution, arena. So a lot of people, probably independent filmmakers like us, think, the most important thing is to make the film. At the beginning, you think it's collecting the data or doing the interviews, but then what do you do with that, and the editing process, and then digging in the archives? And it really exploded into this uncontrollable project, which we could have actually worked on for several more years. And then we had to stop ourselves at one point. And then, of course, you release the film, but there is a lot of work. We are still actually doing some work still on the documentary in terms of its dissemination and its distribution.
Wow, it is. It's really quite an undertaking and quite a project. And one of the things that sort of stood out to me is just the idea of being able to go and to find these individuals that lived through it. That's quite an undertaking. I did notice within the film where it was mentioned that some of the information and the archives that you were looking for, that you were not given access to that. Can you elaborate a little bit on that?
Sure. I could start, and then you could pick up whatever I left out. I will talk about maybe the Israeli law, because it's very, very crucial to understand how it impacted us, and then probably Andy would pick up on the details of how we approached that. So basically, after the creation of the State of Israel, and Israel doesn't have a constitution, by the way, but they have a set of laws, establishing laws for the state. And of course, they have the Information Act, or what is similar to an Information Act, which included basically an embargo on information, what they, of course, describe as sensitive information or classified information related to the security of the state for 50 years. So from 1948 to 1998, the majority of the archives on anything related to 1948 and the creation of the state, it could be before, it could be after, of course, it could be things that happened in the 1930s. All of that was classified, by Israel. And Israel had the control over the majority of information on the creation of the state, and also the ethnic expulsion of the Palestinians, the genocide, if you want to call it. And so not only in terms of their information, their images, their archives, their documents, but also in terms of what they stole from the Palestinians. The control over the Palestinian Historical Archive, which was national archives, which were either, intentionally destroyed or looted and hidden, and sealed, basically. So in 1998, a lot of historians, the so-called new Israeli historians, had access out of a sudden to this huge amount, of information that the state was forced to declassify, like Ahlam Muhtaseb, Benny Morris, Avi Schleim, etc., and some other international scholars as well. This is where we had this surge of books on what really happened in 1948, which many Palestinian scholars have been saying for centuries, forever, but nobody was listening. So books like Ahlam Muhtaseb's The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine. Now, after what happened, and out of this, of sudden, Israel found itself kind of like exposed, in terms of what really happened. They went back and first they went back and reclassified a lot of the information they declassified in the first place. And not only this, but they extended actually the restriction or the embargo for another 20 years. And then when it was time to unveil the archives again in 2000, just last year, 2019, actually, well, not last year, no, we are in 2021. In 2019, the Netanyahu government went ahead and extended that embargo for another 20 years. So it is now 90 years. And it is estimated, a lot of scholars estimate that between 90% and 95% of information I'm talking about is still hidden and sealed. It's still classified. That tells you something about the amount of silencing of information. So Andy, if you want to maybe address, the different things we've done.
Like so so we probably the thing you're referring to in the documentary is the Deir Yassin photographs, and there is by all accounts a collection of photographs of the massacre at Deir Yassin in Israeli archives, and a number of people over the years have attempted to get a hold of these photographs. No one has succeeded. There was a lawsuit several years back for a recent documentary about Deir Yassin, and they yet again extended the classification period for these photos. That extension actually ended shortly before we had finished our documentary, and so or we were finishing it, and so we figured, why not try if it's officially over. So we sent in a request for those photographs, and were summarily denied. That said, and so it would be critical to get all of these photographs and to really understand the story. The fact that these are hidden when so many other photographs are not, I think speaks a lot. That said, we were able to get a large number of photographs. We spent years collecting photographs from all sorts of different organizations, and ended up with about 2,000 photographs from 1948, from before, as well as you saw some of the military documents that we collected. Those are straight from the archives, and then we had them translated so that you could actually read them in English. We also, yeah, go ahead.
Some of these were from the Israeli Army's archives.
Yeah, they all were, in fact. Yeah, the military documents you see are straight copies of the original documents from the Israeli military archives, and then we translated them. So the English that comes over them is what we added, but that's a translation of what you're seeing. So. And now we're, one of the things I'm trying to do is find a place for all these photographs, because, there were so many, probably 90% of them we couldn't use in the documentary. So I'm trying to find a home for those photographs to live. So working on that.
Well, that sounds like a museum to me. Maybe we'll we'll look into that.
We're thinking of our website also to expand it.
Yeah.
The full interviews, actually, because we collected over 90 interviews. Some were shorter, probably actually with everything I did in 2006, definitely over 100. But we used only 33 in the documentary. So we have a wealth of information that we have collated over the years that we definitely should probably at one point start posting on our website.
Sounds good. Or another film. We have a question from one of our Facebook viewers, Hannah Achlam. What is your reply to people who watch this movie and claim that it's more one-sided, telling the Arab side? Although I thought you did a pretty good job of bringing all different viewpoints, but what's your opinion on that?
Where are we at? Am I first or you first? I can't remember where we're at.
So we don't fight. I'm just kidding.
So a few things. This, for one, we had many conversations about this over the decade that we were producing this documentary, and we both recognize that there is no one in the world, no news person, no anyone who has ever been completely unbiased. Everyone comes from somewhere. You have your own upbringing. You see the world through the lens that you grew up in and that you currently live in. And so there's no way we can make 100% unbiased story, because that's just not possible. That said, we did our very best to be fair, to listen to both sides. It was a lot of work going out to meeting Israelis, finding Israelis who would be willing to speak about what happened in 1948. But we thought it was critical to do, because if we just tell the Palestinian side of the story, then, people in America, that's who we made this documentary for, Americans, they're not going to believe it. They're not going to really, they're going to feel like it's one-sided. And we also did a massive amount of research for this documentary. I mentioned the photographs that we collected, but we also went through about 20,000 pages of research. I'm staring right now at our document that we put together for with just notes that we took from those, and it's over 300 pages long. One of the interviews that we did, the interview in Deir Yassin, set us back about 6 months, so we could fact check everything that we put in the documentary, and make sure that we weren't just telling stories that we heard. We were telling stories that we could back up with research. And so, first of all, it's we put a massive amount of research into this, because we know that this is such a controversial topic, and people are so sensitive to having this sort of one-sided perspective. Second, it's hard to tell this story as bad things happen on both sides, because yes, they did, but when you look at the numbers of how many homes were destroyed on the Palestinian side, how many people were lost, they just don't compare. This wasn't two equal forces fighting against each other. This was one organized army fighting against small villages and towns all over, and it's just not going to end up in in an equal result. It's going to end up how it did, which is with most of the Palestinian people being pushed off of their land. So if you're going to tell the story, you have to tell it that way if you're going to get it accurate.
I just want to add that we definitely scholarly and factual accuracy were the most important elements for us, as Andy said. And that's really the biggest motivation for us to tell the story the way we did, in a very scholarly manner. Actually, to the extent that we had to sacrifice some of the artistic value of the film. For example, when we first edited the film, we didn't want to go straight forward, like in chronological order, and make it more artistic, where we make 2 flashbacks, etc. And then we tested it on my graduate students and my colleagues. Actually, I did like a focus group session where we watched the first cut. I think it was the first or second cut. It was like 2 hours or 2.5 hours long. And they were very patient, and they gave us a lot of excellent feedback. But we noticed that because it's complicated, that it was the best way was to actually narrate, in a chronological order like we did. And so, because we took this scholarly, I don't understand how people could even think that we did that. But I honestly think that Israel, the Israeli lobby and their arms, they just don't want anyone to tell the story, full stop. And you could tell by what I just stated. It's very important always to establish the issue of the Information Act in Israel, the embargo on information and the extensions. So obviously they want to hide the story. They don't want people to talk about it. But there was nothing, no one could ever come and say there are any factual mistakes we did in the film. We actually had a lineup of some of the best scholars in the United States on the topic who actually even reviewed the film for us after we finished. Other than interviewing all the famous scholars on the topic themselves, like the most famous around the world, actually, we had to chase them in 7 different countries. And it's always, as Andy said, neutrality or objectivity is just something that can never be achieved. Even some Palestinians actually didn't like the fact that we interviewed Israelis, for example. They thought we were equating the colonizer with the colonized, and that's also, I reject that, and I think it's simplification really of what we tried to do. But we tried to get evidence from everywhere we could find it, and that evidence sometimes was in the exact words of the Israeli fighters who participated actively in the ethnic expulsion of Palestinians.
Thank you. Great. Samir, who's watching on Eventive, says many of the Israelis you interviewed are still Zionists, maybe with some regrets. Did they share their motivations for speaking up?
And they talked to all of the Israelis. So I'll let him talk about that.
So I, it's really hard to get into people's heads and understand, why they're speaking to me. One thing is when I decided I'm going to go interview the Israelis, I reached out to two different local people, and I said, just find me people who were around in 1948 and participated or were part of the events. And about a couple of months went by, and they both called me back independently. They hadn't even spoken to each other, and they said the exact same thing, which was, I don't think we can do this. They said, everybody I talked to says, this is, the words were something like, this is something we don't talk about. And so I said, I already bought my plane ticket, like this is happening. So we're gonna make this work one way or the other. And eventually they found some people. I personally found some people. I think, the people who were willing to speak up had different motivations depending on who they were. Certainly some of them were still Zionists and didn't have any regrets about it. I think Mordechai Bar-On was the most interesting for me. He's a very well-known historian, in addition to being a veteran company commander. He's the guy that said, that explained step by step how they would do it. We first launched the mortars, and then we would fire some rounds from our machine guns, and then we would go into the village. And because there was no one defending, by the time we got there, everybody was gone. This was like kind of more early in the fighting, and he clearly, he understood that what was going on was bad for the Palestinians, and he didn't seem to take any, he didn't seem to revel in that, but he certainly wouldn't take back anything he'd done. Mm-hmm. And, I don't agree with, his positions, whether you agree with them or not. Like, I appreciate the honesty. I appreciate that he was willing to share the stories, the specifics of the story. There were other people that I think were, much more regretful about what had happened, like Hava Keller for sure, and her husband Yaakov Keller. And I think a lot of these people, you have to understand, like, we're not interviewing the generals, we're not interviewing the people who made the decisions at the top. These are people who were teenagers when all of this happened, and they didn't really have a lot of choice other than flee the country, which is not really an option when you're a teenager, or join the fighting. Everybody was joining the fighting. And so these aren't the people that are really making the decisions. And this is a formative moment in their lives. This is like the biggest thing really for most of these people that happened in their lives. And so they just want to share this story. I think, the question of regret, we get a lot, and I don't want to reach into people's heads. They didn't talk about that, but I think it's certainly different for different people. But what I most appreciate is when people shared what they did and what happened with honesty and forthrightness.
I think after Andy brought the interviews and I started listening to them in a lot of anticipation, and I was shocked. Of course, I was shocked at some of the honesty. I have to agree with Andy, and the very graphic details that people were willing to share, the Israelis, I mean. But at the same time, as a communication studies scholar, I couldn't help but notice in communication, we have a theory called cognitive dissonance theory. And the manifestation of that theory in some of the interviews, in most actually of the interviews, are just unbelievable. Where people usually try to avoid any cognitive dissonance, any noise in their brain, For example, if you are a conservative, you would definitely listen and watch Fox News, for example. You avoid, any noise or cognitive dissonance from other sources, like, other types of news, etc. And that's, was very, very weird in those interviews, especially the Bar on one, where people found a way of explaining something very problematic and they recognize it, but at the same time find a way in their mind to justify it. Even the ones who regretted what they did. Let's take Hava Keller, for example. So Hava Keller, in one part, she talks about the baby losing the shoe and crying and breaking down and looking at the ugly face of war. But if you notice that, later in the film, she took a gun and went down to the the neck desert, and she actively participated in the ethnic well, I don't like the word cleansing, that's why I avoid it. I think it's a euphemism for genocide or ethnic expulsion, but the ethnic expulsion of the Palestinians and driving them out at gunpoint. So it's just very interesting, look into the psyche of the Israelis who committed those crimes. Andy probably has more empathy with them. I actually don't, because if they did at that time, if they did what they did, that's one thing. But why aren't they acting on it now, rejecting? Even if they stayed in Israel, they should do what someone like Ilan Pappé, for example, did, rejecting their Zionist ideas. The majority of them were Zionists. Even Hava Keller. So I know a friend of Hava Keller I actually met in London, and when I screened the film like over 3 years ago. And she said that the way she wouldn't actually even go to demonstrations at the beginning. The way they tried, impacted her to speak and to be active, etc., was actually her son, Ahlam Keller, I think his name, who was a famous activist in Israel, who was anti-Zionist himself, etc. So, but for her, she lived for years on Palestinian land, doing what she did. Maybe she had remorse, I don't know, but she did not manifest in actions that remorse for me. So I find it very problematic that Israelis still, the majority of them, with a very small minority, they still hold on to their Zionist beliefs, even those who know very well what happened, and they actively participated in the real narratives of what happened, which is an ethnic cleansing of more than half of the Palestinian population at that time.
There was one Israeli or former Israeli fighter who we interviewed that did leave, Yosef Ben Eliezer, who was the one that compared what was happening to the Palestinians to what was happening, what had happened to him when he was, forced out of Germany in the Holocaust. And so, but that was the one from who we spoke with.
I thought that was a very powerful moment in the film as well. Thank you. Harriet Levin wants to know, has anyone tried to censor you from telling the story of the Nakba and try to censor really this film and affect the film?
Where do we start, Andy? From the letter to my president,
I think the
university.
I think the best story is probably the West Hollywood one.
So we had, and actually there were stronger attempts than others. And then I noticed that the strongest attempts to silence us were when official institutions invited us, not students groups. So a lot of MSAs, SJPs, youth movement, students, whenever this happened, or certain, departments that are known to be radical, etc., we didn't face a lot of pushback. The majority of pushback were when official institutions and universities invited us, like departments or colleges, because we were invited by some colleges. And of course, there were certain, institutions of higher education that were more prominent than others, that also impacted, the response, and also the West Hollywood story, as Andy said. So, for example, in my school, because the Palm Desert campus of my school, Cal State San Bernardino, did a screening for us, and it was organized by the associate dean, who used to be my colleague and my chair actually, and knew all the developments of the film and supported me, etc. There was the biggest pushback, to the extent when Andy and I went to the screening and Q&A, and that was in 2018. They sold out 200 seats. And I've never seen so many rich, white older people as we saw that day, but it was great. All the pushback provided us with free publicity, basically. And after the film and the discussion, they were wowed. The majority of them, except those who came with APAC and tried to actually actively stop us just minutes before the beginning of the film, there was the APAC guy, was already there trying to convince the dean, and I saw him. I was actually standing last meeting, and he was so angry. Except those people, the majority of the audience were like, "Thank you so much for coming. Wow, that was an eye-opening event, etc." We had a lot of people when we screened at UCI, University of California, Irvine. It has a lot of Zionists there, and there were 4 different colleges that sponsored the screening. It was a higher level, and this is, as I said, this is usually when they really go crazy. And also when we screened at Harvard and MIT, although it was students groups, but I think it's the prominence of the universities, and because it was part of Palestine Week, etc. So we received some of the heat that the students were receiving at that time. In West Hollywood, I'll try to be as brief as possible. We succeeded in securing, with the help, of course, of like a marketer, a film marketer, to secure us a screening spot on the schedule of what is called West Hollywood Human Rights Speaker Series. And that was great. So film screening followed by a panel discussion. And it was a lot of back and forth. And initially they said, okay, the film speakers are not going to speak. They are just going to introduce the film and be there. But we need a panel of speakers from both sides. And I said, what do you mean by both sides? This is a scholarly film. If you insist on a panel, then it has to be a scholarly panel. I don't want rabbis to come and discuss the film. I don't want imams to discuss the film. You know what I mean? I said scholars who are, and I can get you like a long list, and you can choose whoever you want. And we managed actually to get a very nice, very well educated and informed panel from universities in Southern California. And then, and the event sold out. Then they started the pushback. A letter was leaked to us from a rabbi in West Hollywood, said it was terrible. She basically focused on me, didn't mention Andy, and copied and pasted from a website, if some people know it, Canary Mission, all the terrible things about me, like I support terrorism, I'm anti-Semite, etc. With just copied and pasted. Didn't even give credit to where she.
Which incidentally are not true.
Yeah, yeah, I have to say very clearly, absolutely not true. So anyway, so they said, oh, we need more time to promote it. I was like, promote what? You already sold out. Well, it's now it's going to be the holidays. We would like to postpone it after the holidays. Then we had to confront them, really. And we had to we discovered that they received a lot of letters. We had to do a counter massive campaign. And in the case, I'm very well connected in the academic, community. So I had a lot of scholars write to them, from famous institutions, some really famous names, from UCLA, USC, etc. And one of the professors from USC wrote actually an op-ed in 2 different publications critiquing the attempt to silence us under different pretenses. Even I have to say that my university actually, the provost asked 2 deans to respond. The provost and 2 deans responded actually to West Hollywood and wrote them a letter protesting what they did. So a lot of pushback, and that's actually an important lesson of perseverance also. They were forced to reschedule. Then they postponed, and then we pushed back. They forced to reschedule. So they canceled on us 3 times, then rescheduled for the 4th time for April 15, 2019. And the last attempt by the Israeli lobby was to try to change the laws the event sponsoring and the events organizing laws, at the local, like the bylaws of the city of West Hollywood. And so we learned last minute that on April 1st, that proposal was going to be discussed at the city hall meeting. So a lot of my friends, about maybe 20 of them, different activists from Southern California, including 2 of my, or maybe more actually, scholars who went there, who live, in the vicinity of Los Angeles. And then people convinced me. They said, you have to go. So I went and I prepared a statement. You could deliver a statement in 2 minutes. And I sat through 46 terrible comments and statements accusing me of the most horrible things you can imagine. Again, the terror, supporting terrorism and being anti-Semite and being hateful, etc. No one mentioned Andy. We were also in the news. No one mentioned Andy, by the way. It was all me, the woman of color who can't be trusted. And I was the easy target, and I mentioned that in my statement. But I sat through 46 statements, and most of these people did not even see the film. The majority of them. Probably there were only few who said they watched the film and didn't like it. There were a lot of people from West Hollywood who came who were actually not activists or anything, just citizens, and they said, "Don't make a decision on our behalf. We want to see the film and decide for ourselves." And anyway, we thought that the vote would be 3-2 against the film and changing the laws, but after one of the council members watched the film, she changed her vote, and we won. And we screened on April 15 with a full house. And actually, there was a long line on the waiting list because, as they usually do, they reserve all the seats and they don't show up. But we knew that trick, so we told the city, and the city actually said, no problem, we'll have a lineup 15 minutes before, and by a certain time, if those people who reserve the seats don't show up, we'll just let in all the people who come in. And so there was a huge line. So again, they made us a very nice publicity. So I just want to end by saying we have to always defy. We can't give up. We have done nothing wrong. It's our constitutional right. It's against the law to silence us. It's against the law to infringe on our academic freedom and our freedom of speech. And we have to always challenge that. I even actually submitted a FOIA through a lawyer. I used their tactics.
Thank you. Anybody that thought you were an easy target, Dr. Ahlam, doesn't know you, so. And I can identify completely, because even as a small film festival, we have had issues with some of the films, and we have a wide range of films, but anytime there's a film on Palestine, we have individuals that are sent specifically to try to affect the film and the showing of the film. And yeah, perseverance, definitely. We have a question from Dr. Nat Gottlieb, who wants to know, how did you corroborate the details on Deir Yassin given the Israeli block on those archives?
Excellent film. And Deir Yassin is our favorite story. I'll start and then I'll let Andy end, because it happened in a very weird circumstances. So up until 2014, for that reason, and because we didn't have any survivors or any Israelis who fought in Deir Yassin in our interviewees, we decided not to have a segment on Deir Yassin and just to narrate, what happened, like Andy would, he's the narrator of the film, he would just state what happened up until 2014. So in 2014, when Israel invaded Gaza and shelled the hell out of Gaza, I was participating in the protest actually in San Diego, consistently. And I noticed that there was this old man who came to the demos every time with his old, like ailing wife, they were older couple, and he would bring her a chair and seat her. He would give candy to my son who accompanied me all the time, or the other kids. He was just very interesting, like grabbed my attention. So I think on the last demo, because that was when they announced the truce, I thought, I would never see him again, probably. I have to know who he is. So I went, introduced myself, and I asked him, Ammo, where are you from? Who are you? Like, where are you from? And he said, Aziz Aql, who's the brother of Uthman Aql that we see in the documentary. And he said, well, I'm from Deir Yassin. And I was like, you're from Deir Yassin? Like Deir Yassin? And he said, of course, there's only Deir Yassin. Like, yeah, what are you talking about? And I said, are you a survivor? He said, yes. I said, do you remember anything? And he said, of course, I remember everything. I was 8 years old and I survived, through the massacre. And I was like, oh my God. And I knew Andy would kill me at that point because we were in post-production. And he was like, we have to finish this. Like, we just have to put an end to the film and just finish the editing and get it out. We were very exhausted and out of our resources, etc. So I still said, would you sit for an interview, knowing that Andy wouldn't like it. And he said, I would, but probably you should talk to my brother. I was like, your brother? You have a brother in San Diego. He lived in San Diego, like, an hour down south of me. And it was like probably 15 minutes away from where Andy lives. And he said, and I said, you have a brother? And he said, yes. I said, where? He said, in Escondido, which is between me and Andy, basically, in the middle of the way between us. And he said, well, he remembers better than me. He was 11 years old. He even wrote 3 books. One of them was on Deir Yassin. I was like, okay, great. So I called Andy and I said, we have to do this. I got, his information, the phone numbers. And we went, interviewed him we were at his house. I was at his house for 3 hours. We interviewed him for over an hour. He had maps. Some of the maps he actually drew by his hand from his memory. He had books on Deir Yassin in addition to his book, etc. And so we went, and that's really what created the Deir Yassin story, right? We didn't have a story before that. We just wanted to narrate whatever we found in the books. So this is the story of going back in production, actually more than 6 months. I remember at that time, I kept on going back and forth for about 8 months, fact checking. We first, created a list of, we discovered that there were a lot of Deir Yassin survivors in the United States. We just didn't know about them. So we started actually compiling a list. I put, notes on my Facebook, and he did his own work and came up with a list himself. And what I did is I started calling those people and taking extensive notes and sometimes translating also the interviews for Andy, because some of the people, some of the older people spoke in Arabic. We tracked some of the resources that were not even available in the United States. For example, Arif al-Arif's book, I think I have it behind me. Oh, yes. It's 3 volumes. I'll get it in a minute. But 3 big volumes, if you see them, the first 3 books there. Arif al-Arif was a Palestinian scholar and actually survivor of 1948. And he was a politician also. He was not a politician. He was a government employee of Jordan, and he went from one town to the other. So he was very involved in the documentation process. And he wrote an amazing book with an introduction by Walid al-Khalidi, not Rashid al-Khalidi, but Walid al-Khalidi, his uncle, and who actually, Walid al-Khalidi, fact-checked the 3 volumes. And it was a massive, amount of information, with a lot of information on Deir Yassin, from interviews, from his own observations. We got a copy of Hatem Kanana's book, who's a professor. Dr. Hatem is a professor at Birzeit University. He's retired now. I translated his book. It was a small book on Deir Yassin, where he actually did one of the best authentic, first-hand interviews with survivors of Deir Yassin. And one of the first people to say the actual number of people who got killed in Deir Yassin was about 109 or 110 instead of 250, like the Haganah promoted at that time to scare people out of their lands. So we did a lot of that. And then Andy wanted an Israeli person to interview, which we didn't have at that time. So Andy, go ahead.
So, that story was so powerful from Ahlam Aql that I felt like, I think we both felt like we can't just put that in there by itself. And so I had been doing a bunch of research on Deir Yassin already and went through everything that we had and tried to find, the names of everyone on the Israeli side who was there and what and who among them were still alive. And I came up with a list of 3 people, and this was one of the only interviews that was done not by one of the 2 of us. But I talked to a producer there, and I said, can you start calling these 3 people? And the first one she called, it turned out he was too sick, and he actually passed away just a few months later. So he couldn't do it. The second person said, I already wrote a book on this subject, and you can just read my book, and I'm not speaking to anybody. And the last one, he said yes, and that's who you see in the documentary, Mordechai Gehon, who was the Haganah intelligence officer who was in charge of that area. And so we had him in the documentary, but at the same time, we had to corroborate his stories. We had to corroborate Othman Achlam's stories, and Ahlam talked about some of that. There was a ton of research. Just outside of speaking to people, we also did a ton of research in books. I actually just spent a few minutes going through our research notes, and we had over 20 books and journal articles that we reference in our notes for this section. There were, the Israelis haven't released what happened, their official reports from the archives, but a number of Israeli fighters have given stories about what happened. The most famous is Meir Pael, who was the photographer who took the photos, which is why we know there were photos. And he's given several accounts. A number of others have given accounts, as well as Palestinians. And there were also the Red Cross showed up after the initial fighting, but while the Israelis were still there and walking from house to house, and so the Red Cross showed up and gave a report. The British showed up at one point and gave their own report. So there is a fair amount of detailed information. The other thing that's this was not like the people who perpetrated this were not trying to keep it a secret. It was just the opposite, in fact. They held a press conference the same day. Mordechai Renan held a press conference, and they asked him how many people they had killed, and he didn't know at the time. He said but he just made up an answer. He said, and I'm quoting here, until now we have counted 254 Arabs killed. And later on, years in 1987, they asked him about this, and he said, people had estimated 100 or 150 people were killed. I told the journalists that 254 were killed so that they would publish a large number, and so that the Arabs would be shocked, not only in the area of Jerusalem, but all over the country. And this objective was achieved. And that's how this number took root in the public mind. And interestingly, that's a number that stuck around for quite some time in the scholarship, and you'll still see it in books. Sharif Kanane, who is a historian, Palestinian historian in the documentary, he's the one that figured out that it was actually more like 110, give or take.
Actually, I just want to say that the Israelis also blamed it on the Palestinians, the wrong number. They said the Palestinians exaggerated the number and spread the rumor because they wanted, like the Arab commanders wanted the Palestinians to run away, which doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, and on that note, that's one of the it's something we didn't even address in the documentary because it's been so long dispelled, this notion that there were Arab radio broadcasts calling upon Palestinians to flee so that they could make room for the Arab armies to show up. And it was actually Benny Morris who went through, among others, but he's sort of the most famous, who went through the British archives, and the British were actually recording every single broadcast that the Arabs